time to start working on side panels for the arms. Remember this nice little arm spacer we had? It was 8.5 inches tall. Well, we need to make another one of these, but instead of in 3/4 inch plywood or something like that, you're going to need to make one out of a 1/4 inch MDF. This is 8.5 inches tall and 12 inches long, which is going to be just a little bit wider than what the panel is going to end up being, but it's going to give us a good start to find out where the panel would be centered or placed between our upper rail and our arm. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get this spacer here inside of the arm, between the arm and the upper rail. And then, so what I'm doing right now is I'm just taking the spacer, and it's very tight. There we go. Into the upper rail, in between the arm and the upper rail, and I'm just going to push it back. I had to make a new piece of MDF because I didn't notice that this piece of MDF was bowing like this. So instead of being flat or close to even flat, it had a really good curvature in it. So this piece just wouldn't work. The piece that we need to use needs to be very flat, or very, at least close to flat, because we're helping to use it to decide where the beginning and the end of our panel is going to be. So I have my piece back in here again, and what you want to do is make sure it's roughly centered. You know, my piece for my rail is 3/4 inch thick. This is roughly 1/4 inch. So you can take a square like this and use it to make sure the panel is centered. I also happen to have for myself this Incra square here, the indent inside, right here, between the red and the gold aluminum, or aluminum, whatever. The gold aluminum is 1/4 inch. So if I take this, and I'm just going to use it to, with the pressure against, from behind, against my square here, I'm going to be able to move the MDF to find out where I want it to enter into the upper arm. Now the MDF is going to, the actual panel itself will enter into the upper arm, and it will sit inside of it in its own recess up here. Here is a still from farther along in the project. What I did not take footage of here, and should have, was showing you when I was placing this MDF panel where it would sit in the arm. You need to make sure that wherever this panel is inside of the arm above, that it has a good amount of meat or wood on each side of the groove, and this will help you find how far back you can push the panel. After a little bit of testing back and forth, I think this is where I want to have the panel end at the back. So what I'm going to do is, with my marker, I'm going to come in here and make a mark. This mark will be the back reference for this panel. Now what I need to do is flip this over and see if the same spot works in the back. On the other side, that is. Before I flip the chair around and test the panel out on the other side, I came down and I made a mark right here across the rail. And I'm doing this so I can measure how far from the rear leg my panel is supposed to be. So if that around, if I take the edge of the square and I butt it up against the leg, and where the apron enters into the leg, and I get everything meeting right here, that line at that point is marked at 1 inch, 1 1/8 inches. So I can now transfer that measurement. Okay, I just transferred across my measurement for the rear part of the panel. And I'm bringing my dummy panel over, grabbing my square, or whatever you're going to use for your spacer. And testing out the fit. Now that the panel is set for the back on both sides, and it works for both sides, it's possible that where you put the panel on one side doesn't work for the other, and you may have to move them either most likely up forward for both sides. Now, where my panel enters, is going to enter into the arm and the upper rail may be different from where your panel is going to enter. It all depends on what the final width of this template was when we pattern routed it, how much you had to clean it up, where you positioned it in the center, or as close to a center as you can get within the rear leg. So there's lots of variables here. So I don't want you just to say, oh, I'm going to go up 1 1/8 inch like Matthew did. Find where this positioning is for you and then make your marks then. Now that we've got the back, let's deal with the front. So the total width of this panel is 12 inches, but the total width of the panel we're going to put in is obviously not going to be 12 inches because it ends before this little indent up here on the arm. So the question becomes, how far back do we want to go? And I think the answer to that is we start testing it and seeing what looks good, because once again, your templates may be a little bit different than mine. So you need to test what this panel is going to look like. That's why we have this nice little MDF panel here to give us an understanding of what things are going to look like. So I came in and I made a mark where the bottom of this little round piece right here on the bottom of the arm is. And with that mark made, now what I need to do is decide where I want the panel to enter into the arm. So I'm thinking maybe I'll come back 1/4 inch. So after I made this mark where the bottom of the round part of the arm is, I came back roughly 1/4 inch or so. So I'm just going to come over here and with my marker just extend down that line a little bit. And I'm going to go over to the table saw and rip off this piece right here. I have the cut panel in here right now. And after taking a look at it from a little bit of a distance, I think that I want to take off maybe another, somewhere between 1/16 inch and 1/8 inch on the width here. I just think that all over the chair, there's a good gap between when the round part ends and where the next thing begins. And so I took another 1/16 inch off, and I think I'm there. I'm going to have to come in and make some marks on both sides for the end of where the panel is going to enter into the upper rail. So I'm just going to make a mark right there. Take my panel out. And then bring that mark across in the same angle as I did for the rear. So it's just going to flip that over. I'm bringing those marks down because later on I'm going to use them on the router table to tell me where I need to stop and start my cut. So I have my 2 rails here at the router table, which means I took the chair apart, except not completely. I took the front and the back off from the sides, and the front and the back are still clamped up, so I can just reclamp the chair up pretty quickly. But I have these over here now. And before I do any work on these, I need to do a little bit of setup here on the router table. The first thing I did was make some marks for myself where this 1/4 inch bit begins and ends, and its most outer portion in this axis right here. What that does for me is it shows me where I can start and end my cuts when I'm moving this piece across the table. The next thing I did was I set the depth of cut. Now earlier in the video I told you that you should try to get this in the center, right? It's a 1/4 of an inch panel, 3/4 of an inch upper rail, and that means if it's a 1/4 of an inch in on each side, you've got this thing right in the center. And I'm still going with that, except when I was looking at mine, what I forgot to say was that my right arm was slightly off center when I placed it in the rear leg. This is why I moved the panel a 1/16 of an inch closer towards the inside of the chair, thus allowing me to push the panel back farther and get it centered into the arm as well. It just looked like if I put it in another 1/16 of an inch, I'd be able to get back a little bit farther and have more meat underneath my arm for the dado cut that I'm going to need to make, or a groove, whatever you want to call it, in the upper arm on one of the sides. So I elected to push this back instead of 1/4 of an inch, which is 4/16, push it back 5/16 of an inch instead. So basically what we're going to do is cut more thickness, or depth that is, than we need here. So I like to put the panel into the upper arm 3/8 of an inch deep. If we're going with 3/8 of an inch on both the top and the bottom, that means that I need to make a cut here that's a little bit deeper than 6/8 of an inch. And what we'll do later is we'll fill in the material 3/8 of an inch, a little bit less than 3/8 of an inch of that material, with a filler piece later. If you haven't done this before, a cut like this before on the router table, basically what we're looking to do is take our piece, set it against the fence here, and drop the piece down until it makes contact with the bit. And I'm going to have it make contact with the bit after where I want that cut to be, and I'll come back and clean it up with a chisel later. So I drop it all the way down, and just keeping the piece pushed up against the fence, run it across until I get just before my final mark here, and lift up the piece, that way completing one pass. And I'll do one pass on each side as I start to build up the depth. So I'll do a pass, set a new depth, do another pass, and then set a new depth again. Now that we've finished cutting the grooves into our rails, it's time to square up the ends, both the front and the back. So I have one of my pieces here, and my vise, and I have a marking knife, square, and some chisels, and we're just going to square this guy up. I'm just going to start with walking over the edge of the groove to both sides. Have that moved over, I can come here with my marking knife. Now that I've squared the end up, I can come in and start cleaning up the rest of it. I'm taking the chisel and I'm pushing it against the wall of the mortise, or the groove here, and I'm using it to help me pare the waste back, just relieving some of that material so that when I pull it out with that 1/4 inch chisel, when I chisel down, it'll come out a lot easier. Alright, we finished squaring up the grooves in our upper rails, and before I forget, my digital dial caliper, I came in here and I measured the thickness of the groove in a couple different spots. I have like 0.261, 0.261, 262. So I'm going to go with 0.261, and I wrote that down on my little MDF panel here so I can remember it later. Because what we're going to end up doing is flattening this piece and then resawing it to pull out two 0.261 inch thick panels for our arms. Now I know this is a really wide piece and the panel's really wide, and I have a 12-inch wide jointer. I'm lucky. These combo machines, I tell you, they're worth every penny. If you don't have a 12-inch wide jointer, and you know, I suspect most of you won't, take a look at this video, the supplemental video for the planer sled, and that'll help you flatten this piece. Of course, you can always flatten it by hand with a jack plane, and this is long enough that a jack plane would actually do this fine. You don't necessarily need a jointer plane here, but either by hand, or if you have a 12-inch wide jointer, or watch the video about the planer sled and build the planer sled and then flatten this guy. Okay, so let's head over to the bandsaw and cut away this extra waste. And yeah, it looks like we're really good. This is the widest part of the board, and I'm just under 12 inches by 1/4 of an inch. So for me, that's perfect. For my jointer, and once again, watch the video on the planer sled, and you'll be able to take this board, or any board for that matter, and build a larger sled if you wanted to, and be able to flatten those in your planer mode or in your planer if you don't have a wide enough jointer. So let's head over to the jointer. At the jointer, I flattened one side and squared up one edge. Now what I'm going to do is resaw off a panel that's just a little bit thicker than the thickness I'm going for. So I actually had this set up for 5/16 of an inch. My fence is locked down nice and tight, and it's time to resaw this thing. Just like before, let the blade do the work. Don't push the piece through or try to manhandle it through or have it go any faster than it really wants to go. Just let the blade do its job, make sure it's nice and sharp, and you shouldn't have a problem. Alright, we got two panels, and they look really great. I'm loving the cathedral pattern here on both sides on this one. And this has a cathedral pattern as well. It's a little bit different because it's a little bit deeper in the board, but it still looks great. Now, after we resaw these, I thickness planed them, but I didn't thickness plane them all the way down to their final dimensions, which was 0.261 inches. Instead, I'm sitting around, 274. So I'm sitting around 0.274 inches for both of these boards, and I did that on purpose. If we brought these down to their final thickness, they would fit perfectly into our grooves. However, we still have to sand them or plane them to a final finish. And then all of a sudden the boards become too thin. So instead of leaving them thick, is going to give me the opportunity to bring them down to a final dimension. And before I can final thickness plane my boards here, I do need to cut them to width and length. But even before I do that, since I have a little bit of time right now while I'm waiting for the planing board to glue up, I'm going to come in here and fill some of these voids. For whatever reason, my boards have some small little voids here. They're no more than 1/16 of an inch in diameter at any point. Not even that large, more like a 32nd of an inch. And they're black colored. and I'm going to put in some black epoxy, black colored epoxy into these voids. Unfortunately for me, they are on both sides of the board, so I'm going to have to do this over for myself. I'm going to wait a full 24 hours. You may be able to wait somewhere around 4 to 6, just depending on the climate you're in and your patience level. What we're going to do is we're going to mix up a 2-part 5-minute epoxy, and then we're going to add just a drop or two of this oil stain that's ebony colored. And we'll mix them together. We'll apply little drops onto each hole and make sure that that drop fills the hole, or that the amount of epoxy fills the hole, and then just mushrooms over it just a little bit. Enough that you know you're definitely, when you start scraping it back, going to be level to the surface. Took the clamps off our planing board. I have it clamped into the bench right now, and I have one of my side panels, or rough side panels here. The epoxy's dried. I have a card scraper, and it's time to just lightly scrape off the epoxy above the surface. So one of the things you don't want to do is to attack it too aggressively. You don't want to accidentally lift the epoxy on the top plus the epoxy that's inside as well, and then create yourself a new divot or a slightly different size divot than before, or void. With my card scraper, I'm just going to come over here and start removing material. I turn the board around so I can hit the high spots on the epoxy from the other side. Alright, I have the epoxy scraped off and nice and level with the surface of the board. The next thing to do is decide where you want to center at least for me, where I'm going to center my cathedral pattern on the board, or as get it center as much as possible. So this board is wider than the groove I cut earlier into this rail. Let's take a closer look at this. Right now I have the board for the right on what I want to have is the show face, or the outside face of the chair. And I have my piece here with where my beginning and the end of my groove is. So basically what I want to do is kind of find where I want to position everything. So I'm just going to, I can move my rail back and forth until I find that spot that I like. And I want to try to get actually as far forward on this side as possible, because that then puts the center of this cathedral pattern right about there, as close as I can get it to the center between these two distances here. So for me here, I'm going to try to make sure, I'm going to take this side of the board over here and joint that edge, and then rip this edge over here to width. As far as the height's concerned, I want this to start as low as possible to this point. So I'm going to have to cut or cross cut it, somewhere probably around here, and lose a little bit of this bottom in order to get a nice flat bottom to this, and then cut it for its total height, which will be the 8.5 inches plus 3/8 of an inch on each side. Now that I've jointed this edge and then cross cut the bottom on both pieces, I can bring up my rail, and if I'm going to use this as my front, I can see where my back is. And I can just make that mark and follow that mark down. After I make the mark for the length, bring it down to the bottom, I'm also going to move the mark all the way around to the other side as well. The reason I'm doing this is so that when I run the other edge against the fence on the table saw, I will be able to align this cut here with these 3 marks around up to the blade on the table saw. See that? I have my panel here, and I set up my fence so I'm cutting just over the line, and that's on purpose. What I want to do is make that first rip and then slowly move over to a tighter and tighter fit, or to the right size, that is. So what I'm trying to do is just get the piece to fit between the front and the rear. And once I get that perfect fit, then I'm done for now. Later on, however, with some hand planes, we will take down the total thickness of the board from the front to the back to allow for expansion and contraction of the board across its width inside of the space we routed out here. Now that I have this cut to width with one bottom or one edge flat, which is the bottom, or square, what I'm going to do is take a marker and mark that this is the right. I'm going to put an F with an arrow towards the front, which will be over here, and then which side is the out-facing side. Here. And I'm just going to take a look at the grain direction and see what direction the grain's running, so I know which way to orient my board when I'm planing. So the grain's going up this way in this direction, so I'm going to plane with the grain. Get this guy in here. Let's take a quick measurement too. Right now we're at 0.267, 0.268, and right here in our groove, 0.258, 259. So we need to make sure we take, at least for me, I'm going to take very thin shavings. Now, if you don't want to do this with a hand plane and you want to do this with a power solution, you can always get a drum sander and drum sand these with like some 220 grit, and you'd have a perfect finish that's ready for oil or varnish or wherever else you're going to finish this, but it's ready to be finished. Perfect surface for that. If you don't have a drum sander and you're thinking about using a random orbital sander, please don't. And the reason is the random orbital sander is so hard to keep from creating small divots and waves inside of the panel here, or any sanding for that matter. So I would recommend you grab a sanding block, throw some sandpaper on it, and sand both sides by hand, going with the grain. You'll thank yourself for it later, because you'll get a nice smooth finish. You'll be able to take off even amounts and then just focus on one area that you may feel is a little too high after you check it with the dial calipers here. So I have a nice not heavy, I have a nice light cut on this. I'm going to start making passes on my board to, on one side, make an even amount of passes, flip the board over, and make an even amount of passes on the other side. So after a little bit of planing, some sweat, here we go. I got the board, it fits both sides. This is good. I can hold it, the board, or the panel that is, stays in the groove, and nothing moves. Not forcing it, just nice, perfect fit. Same thing in this direction. Then if I grab my there we go. We're in. Just a perfect amount of hand pressure, nothing extra. Now this panel here had a significant bow in it after sitting here for about a day or two. And I decided, instead of using a hand plane on it, because the other one was relatively flat, this one was very bowed, as I said, I decided I'd hand sand it down to thickness. And that's what I've done. I just did a test fit, and we're good, at least for the first 1/16 of an inch or so. So I'm going to just hammer this in a little bit. That feels really good. Looks good, nothing's moving. What I'm going to do though is grab a pencil and make a mark on the inside here. That way when I take the board out, I'll know how deep I am right now. And my square, let's see how deep I am. It's about 5/8 of an inch deep. And this is 6/8. So we're getting there. We're getting there. This is a great start now. I set my fence to 9 2/8 of an inch, and then I decided that I was going to take 1/16 of an inch off. The reason I set it to 9 2/8 of an inch is 8.5 inches plus 6/8 of an inch is 9 2/8, and I just took 1/16 inch of an off from that. So that means I'm at, let's take a look. Yeah, sorry, 9 3/16 of an inch from the blade. So what I'm going to do right now is just cross cut these guys. I have my 2 panels here, and they're set into the rails, the upper rails. The amount of space between the top of the panel and the top of the upper rail right now is just under 8.5 inches, or just at 8.5 inches. Now the space between where the arm starts and the top of the rail is 8.5 inches as well. However, we routed our dados into our 2 side rails deeper than the 3/8 of an inch we want to be. We actually routed it at 6/8 of an inch, or just a little bit more than 6/8 of an inch. And that was so that we could purposely set these panels in too deep. You want to save these cutoffs, because this is where the cutoffs are going to come in handy. Right, not now, but a little later, we're going to rip off 3/8 of an inch strips from the cutoffs, and then glue and those down into these dados, or the slots in our upper rails, and get them all the way on the bottom. Just a little bit of glue on the bottom of the mortise there. And what that's going to do is it'll lift the total bottom or depth of this slot up, or dado. And that's really important, because then we'll have the extra meat we're going to use to put into our upper arms. Speaking of the arms, I want to do something before we put the chair back together and start finding the location of these panels in the arms. And what I want to do is find the center of the front legs right now, and then we're going to drill into the front legs. The connection between the arms and the front legs is a dowel right here. In the original chairs, they may have been a mortise, but I'm using a dowel to do this work. And not only am I using a dowel, I am actually doing 2 different size holes too. The hole we're going to drill into the leg is just slightly larger than the hole we're going to drill into the arm. And that's going to allow us to have a little bit of wiggle room for placement. And when we put the epoxy in here, we'll put just enough epoxy in here that we don't, when we put the dowel in, it won't come out of the leg, but it'll be enough that it will completely wrap the dowel with epoxy when it dries, adhering the dowel to the upper leg, and then in the arm itself, we can just use regular glue to glue the dowel into the upper arm. In order to find the centers, we need a ruler or square and a pencil. I'm actually going to mark this in pencil because I want to be more exact than I would be with a pen. So we just got to take the ruler here and get it lined up so that the corner of the ruler and the pencil align. And once you find that, strike yourself a line, and then on the opposite end, do the same thing. So I have a bit here, and I haven't put any tape on it to mark yet, but it's a 1/2 inch bit. And I'm gonna mark just a little bit more than the total length of this dowel of a piece of tape, and then end up drilling down to the tape level. These dowels are 1.5 inches long, which means there'll be 3/4 of an inch worth of dowel on each side. So let me go mark this bit and we'll drill some holes. Before I drill my hole, I'm going to take this center punch and I'm going to find the center. I've reassembled the chair, and as you can see, the panels are in the upper rails, and I have my left arm all done. I'm going to walk us through doing the right arm, which is the exact same process on the left arm. And when I say it's done, I have centered the arm on the leg, as well as set the correct depth from the front of the arm to the front of the leg. So let's talk about doing that on the right leg. So, and after we do that, then we're going to move on to the panels. The panels are a little interesting. This one is very straight, but the guy over here, this one on the left, is got a bow on the top still. We got rid of the bow on the bottom by just sheer putting it inside of that groove. However, it's still bowing up on top, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a jig to straighten these pieces out so we can mark out their positions, and we'll do that in a few minutes. Before we do that, let's position this arm. When I did both of these arms earlier in the video, I wrote down the depth I had from the front of the arm to the front of the front leg, and that was 3/8 of an inch, and I wrote that on top of this arm here in pencil. So that's the first measurement. The second measurement is what is the distance between the edges here on the front and the edges on the arm. So let's walk through that. So what I'm looking to do here is just take the square set at 3/8 of an inch and make sure that the front of the leg and the front of the arm both meet each other roughly at 3/8 of an inch. And if you can see, we are right there. So this arm is set at a good depth. The next measurement we want to do, or next thing we want to do, is to find the measurement between the edge here and the front edge of this leg. Same thing on the edge on the outside of the leg and the edge on the arm. And what we want to do is find out what find out what the measurement is to find the center, or to center the arm on top of the leg. And for me, that measurement is roughly 1/4 of an inch, or 4/16 of an inch. And so if I take my square and I put it against the edge of the leg here and I move the arm over, that is at 4/16 of an inch. And if I flip to the other side, looks like to me I'm also at 4/16 of an inch. So those two there, with the arm centered roughly right now, we'll check it one more time when I clamp it down. I'm going to take 2 leather pads, a clamp, And the leather pads are to help prevent the oil from transferring from the pads and the clamp to the wood. Okay, it's clamped in, but it's not too tight. And I'm just going to do the same thing I did before, which is try to find that center. Before we go on to the panels, the next thing I like to do is I take a pencil and I mark the outline of the front leg onto the arm. We're not going to use this to drill our dowel, the hole for the dowel that is, but we are going to use this to help locate the arm when we push the dowel marker down and we make an indent onto the arm itself. So what do I have going on here? Well, what I have going on is 2 pieces of 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood. One is significantly taller than the other, but it has enough room where I can get my marking knife in and mark underneath. The other one isn't as tall and allows me to move it around to get the correct positioning. What I did is once these 2 were clamped up, I took a square of mine and I put it against, or rested it against the upper rail and the panel, the bottom of the panel. And then I sighted down here with my eye and I found where I thought roughly where the distance between both the bottom and the top were even. If you wanted to be a little more exact, you could take one square, push it up against another, find the depth between the 2 spaces on the bottom, and see if the height on the top or the depth between the blade of the square and the panel of Baltic birch plywood is the same. With this panel now squared to the upper rail, I'm going to take my marking knife and just from underneath come around and mark the outline of this panel onto the bottom of my arm. Just to be safe, I decided to move the 1/2-inch plywood panels from the left side of the chair to the right side of the chair. After clamping them up, I make sure that the panel is vertical. And once I make sure the panel is vertical and spaced correctly, I now take my marking knife or pencil and mark around the panel. Well, the chair is looking good so far. We've got the panels into the lower rails and we've marked their locations in the arms. The next thing we need to do is to pull the arms off, pull the panels out, and to start fitting the panels into the arms.